guys ready? Okay. Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Sanibel Public Library today. We are so incredibly lucky today to have our two island historians in the same room with us. And in case some of you do not know them, on my right is Betty Anholt. She has been with the library for a very long time as a reference librarian and cataloger. She's always been interested in all types of history. She's written many books related to the island. We also have Charles LeBuff with us too. He's a founding member of the Sandcap Conservation Fund, also a distinguished author of island history. And I want you all to give them a very special Sanibel welcome.
Hello. Hello. Well, thank you all for coming. Good morning. Good morning. I hope you're going to have a lot of questions related to Sanibel here as we get finished telling you a couple of stories about the islands. And I wanted to read you just a little bit from the back of the book, the back cover, to kind of give you a feeling of what we were looking to do with this book, because it's a little bit different. It is certainly a Sanibel history based on facts, but we have tried to feature some of the people and places and events that really have kind of faded away in history and at the same time are foundational to what we are today. So what we have written is many earlier islanders and their achievements, mistakes, and life-changing moments are lost to us now, but some of their tales and even life lessons endure. Here are a few, and as Uncle Clarence Rutland would famously say, it may or may not be entirely true, but it makes a good story. I don't know how many here today remember Clarence Rutland. I'm sure the name is familiar to some of you, and he certainly was an interesting guy. That's one of the many stories that we'll have in the book. Let's see whether we work. Maybe I'm not close enough.
Should be. Where's our tech guy?
Yeah, he snuck out just then. Here comes one. Ah, there is a switch. I found it. There it is. All right. Okay, so anyway, this is the cover of the book, which is no surprise, I guess.
Yeah.
But this is a picture of one of our mangrove lakes in the background, and also on the cover is one of the lighthouse quarters with waves breaking directly underneath, one of the more erosional times. This would be back in the late 50s. To its right is the Captiva, which was the mail boat. The mail boat ran from 1937, 6 or 7, up until 1963 after the causeway was opened. It actually ran for several months after the causeway and truck traffic reached the islands, because there was a contract that ran until December. And that was U.S. government contract, of course. Then the bottom picture is, I think that's a Chevrolet, correct? 1929. And in the background is the Sanibel School, that's the white school. The car is parked on what's now Periwinkle Way, probably right across what's now Purdy Drive down there by Tahitian Gardens. And the children obviously are school children. The driver of the car is a Mrs. Stewart who, the Stewart family had a farm central on the island up basically near Chateau Saumur. That sounds like a good place. There are, 200 plus photos in the book, and I'm going to now turn it over to Charles.
That quick.
Just like that. Isn't this a lovely picture to start with?
Yeah. They are. Thank you, Betty. It's nice to see everyone here this morning. We appreciate you coming. I'm looking around to see if a couple of my groupies have made it that were supposed to be here, but they're not here at least yet. But I do want to take just a moment to introduce someone. Here in the front is my niece, Deborah Siegel. Deborah grew up part of her life on Sanibel back in the 60s. Before the bridge, she lived with my wife and daughter and I at the lighthouse for almost a year. She attended the schoolhouse that you saw in that photograph. So she's a real old timer. And she just bought a place in Periwinkle Park.
Yay.
So I'm happy to see her here. In the book, we touch on many elements of Sanibel history, and we try to tie in some of the most important features during those periods with a lot of personal anecdotes from people living in and deceased. One of the chapters that I think is one of the best in the book is the chapter on red tide. Red tide is an event that happens periodically here in Southwest Florida. And in my opinion, our account in this book is the best coverage from a local aspect on red tide. So that's the last chapter in the book, and something you can easily digest and comprehend. But red tide happens infrequently. It's been happening since basically the beginning of time. We bring out the early Spanish accounts of red tide events to show that it's not something new that is caused by man, but it's a natural situation. And this shot is from, I believe, the 1971 red tide, which is the worst red tide event I think that Betty and I have ever seen in our days here on the island. This is just a group of rotten mullet that had floated up on a dead-end canal on the eastern part of Sanibel. Red tide is caused by a marine microorganism. It blooms, it multiplies very rapidly, it produces toxins that kill fish, become an aerosol, and affect people with respiratory problems especially. And I started my federal career as just out of my teens in red tide research. And this is the research vessel that I was assigned to back in 1957. And it plied the coast between Pass-a-Grille and Pinellas County all the way down to Marathon in the Florida Keys, collecting water samples for chemical and biological data. This is the 71 red tide during its peak. This shot was taken just to the west of the fishing pier at the lighthouse. You can see the causeway back in the distance. It was just simply amazing. But one thing that was sort of unusual is that in that 71 red tide, there was no massive kill of manatees. The manatee population apparently hadn't come to the peak, or near the peak that it is today, or the system didn't work correctly in the river system to cause marine mortalities because we didn't have any. Here are two manatees from the, I believe, the 1982 red tide, where dozens of manatees were killed by that little marine tide organism. And I think Betty is coming back into the picture now.
Well, I know probably all of you have seen this map many times before, but it is such a lovely thing. I just really appreciate it. And I appreciate the man who drew it, because back in 1883, try to imagine rowing around this island in a rowboat and drawing what was there and walking across. You can see where mangroves were, you can see, unfortunately we don't have a pointer here, but you can see where the Sanibel River is, you can see the Ladyfinger Lake Islands. If you go up by Wolford, you see Clam Bayou, you see Kesson Bayou, you see Bowens and Holloway Bayou. Even up in Blind Pass, you can see the islands up there. He did a fantastic job of illustrating, I guess, basically the map of the island. And then on top of that, they divided it up into these 50 lots and a little town at the eastern end, including where they wanted to put the lighthouse, where it eventually became 50 years later. But one of the things geologically that he doesn't have on this map, because it wasn't there, is a cut in that arm of Tarpon Bay. Thank you. Of course, at the turn, before the turn of the 20th century, that was actually called Ellis Bay. And the homesteader, Sam Ellis, lived on the southern end of Tarpon Bay. He was a retired British Navy man, and retired was an important word in his vocabulary. He was often considered to be lazy. He was certainly a drinker, and probably his most famous characteristic was floating around in a rowboat with a jug of something in that bay while his wife was busy working on shore. But given all of that, he was basically a naturalist. He was interested in what was going on the island, looking at the ecology, the archaeology, and so forth. And one of the reasons why I bring up his, quote, laziness and all of that is that he often was assigned to go over to Pine Island, which is directly north, to the south end where the hotel at St. James City and the store were. And he got tired of rowing all the way to the mouth of Ellis Bay and then back again, because that took an awful lot of time and energy. So he made a cut in that arm that we know as the shallow cut or just the cut. It's not a natural feature, it's one that he wanted to go straight through, and so he did. He would go over there for supplies or the mail. That was where you had to go for the mail at the very beginning of the homesteading era here on Sanibel. And here's a picture of him with Commodore Reed. You're probably familiar with Commodore Creek that runs into Tarpon Bay. The two men are there at the Commodore's palm thatched hut. Both of them lived in palm huts, and Sam Ellis's family, his wife and his stepson, George Underhill, they had more than one hut there. There were at least two and perhaps more. At one point, there we go. At one point, the archaeologist Frank Hamilton Cushing came to visit Sam Ellis. He was told over at the hotel at St. James City that Sam Ellis knew quite a bit about the archaeology of the island. So he came over to visit him and spent a couple of days with them, tramping around some of the southern part of Tarpon Bay, and also he went on up to the where the Shell Mound Trail is today in the Ding Darling Refuge, and took a look around there as well. These are all things that Sam Ellis had informed him about. Cushing was, of course, going at that point down to Marco Key, where in the following year he discovered a number of artifacts, and of course that did include the very famous, internationally famous Marco cat. That is, if you're interested, on display down at the Key Marco Museum right now. And I think for the next 3 years it was not donated, it was loaned to them from the Smithsonian. It's a beautiful and very small thing. Charles has carved for me a replica of that I treasure.
And it's upstairs now. You can see it. You can see it now.
The next one is yours.
Oh, isn't it? Move right along.
Well, we're moving right along because I am hoping that you're going to have a lot of questions, not necessarily about what we're showing, but anything. Okay?
And my collection of Calusa artifacts that I've replicated are on display upstairs. So if you have time after this and you've not seen them, take a look. Oh, we're going to change it. We have a chapter in the book on law enforcement, because law enforcement in the beginning of Sanibel's history wasn't really that complete a system. We go back to the time of the early Lee County sheriffs, where one in particular, Frank Tippins, who was sheriff for 3 different periods of time. But if you've read any of the works of Peter Matheson, like The Killing of Mr. Watson, or the Watson trilogy, Frank Tippins is the sheriff that was involved in those murders, and Watkins' murder. We delved into the historical aspects of what types of crimes occurred on Sanibel and Captiva. And for example, we found a gunfight between a lighthouse keeper and a farmer, where the lighthouse keeper was shot and killed. I think we examined 2 different murders that happened in the early part of the 20th century, and some manslaughter events that happened up into the late 1960s. And we cover the early deputy sheriffs that served on Sanibel Captiva. One interesting person that I knew was a man by the name of Tommy Addison. Here he's pictured on this slide. Tommy lived on Buck Key. He and his wife and 5 children were the last residents of Buck Key. They lived there in very difficult conditions, no electricity, no real potable water, and during very difficult times. And I first met Tommy when I was on turtle patrol in the early 60s, and I was coming back from Bowman's Beach, and near the end of Tarpon Bay Road I saw a boat out in the surf and a fellow pulling a net. And I stopped to see what he was doing, and he introduced himself as Tommy Addison. I said, "What are you catching?" He said, "I'm catching some nice pompano. You want a couple?" "Sure." So he threw me in some pompano, and we didn't become friends, but we knew one another. And then in the early 60s, something that is basically somewhat obscured as to the actual event. This is a shot of Tommy with his 5 children that were raised on Buck Key. After what I'm going to tell you about, the family moved to Marathon in the Florida Keys, and Tommy died a few years ago. He had become a licensed captain. And this is, we're coming into the story, is the famed Andy Rosse. This is Andy and his wife Dessa. They operated Andy's Pier. I guess that's where McCarthy's Marina is located now, right?
Yep.
Yeah. And Andy's was a real juke joint. It was a social center for Sanibel and Captiva in the late 30s, 40s, and 50s. If you wanted to have a good time, if you wanted to take someone dancing, you went to Andy's Pier. And Andy and Dessa were a couple of characters. But one night, Andy and Tommy Addison had a conflict. The reason for the conflict is completely forgotten. His children don't even have a full background on what happened, but they got in a scuffle, and Andy, who today has a street named after him on Captiva, he pulled a knife and he slashed Tommy Addison across the abdomen. Well, Tommy was given first aid, and in those days, with the judges and the sheriff's blessing, you could get out of things like that, like assault with a deadly weapon. So the story goes that Andy paid Tommy a fee to leave Buck Key and go to the Keys, where he became very successful because of the funds that Andy provided. And this is Andy's Pier. Whoop.
That's me.
I didn't know this guy.
I didn't know it either. So this is Captain Andrew Kinzie, as it says below. The Kinzie brothers' steam line, he and his brother George were founders thereof. But the Kinzies came from Germany in about 1885 as children. Their father had come over here to Fort Myers. He was actually a beekeeper, and his mother and the 3 boys came over a few years later. Andrew Kinzie and his brother George both joined the plant line, which was a steam line, and of course Henry Plant was also a railroad man who was, I guess you could say, in competition with Henry Flagler on the East Coast, but the plant line was all on the West Coast. The railroad extended as far south as Punta Gorda, and beyond that point, from the 1880s on, the only way you could get to Fort Myers and anything else south was by boat. The plant line ran a number of boats, but Henry Plant died, I didn't look up the specific date, I think it was 1898, and his holdings got sold off. So the Kinzies, who had been working for the plants, they were working on the St. Lucia steamer, Andrew as purser, who was basically administration, bills of lading, and all that sort of thing. And his brother George, who was an engineer, decided that they would start their own business. And so they got themselves a little boat called the Belle of Myers, and they ran between Punta Gorda and Fort Myers, back and forth, bringing people, taking produce, mail, whatever, back and forth. The Belle of Myers, in case you're a little curious why it was called of Myers instead of Fort Myers, that first decade of the 20th century, Fort Myers actually had changed their name to simply Myers. And then they changed it back again to the fort. So they ran that boat, and then they acquired the Gladys. The Gladys was, there she is, another small steamer. These are wood-burning steamers. This is in Fort Myers, and you might notice on the left side of the boat that pile of vegetation, which is water hyacinths that used to come down the river in great bunches. In fact, Charles has a story in the book about the entire bay being filled with water hyacinth at one point. You might notice on your tax bills, too, that you pay to keep that away. At any rate, the Gladys was, I don't know, maybe 40-foot long boat, something like that. At one point, though, they actually cut her in half and doubled her size, and you'll see a picture of her in the larger dimension as well. But I wanted to mention, too, that Captain Crumpler, who is on the left here, ran the Gladys for the Kinzies. And he mentioned one time during the 1926 hurricane, the Gladys was at dock there in Fort Myers and was undamaged from the storm, and it was because it was so crowded with water hyacinths that the boat couldn't move. So there are some good aspects, I guess, to water hyacinth. Of course, they are a very pretty thing, but I have canoed through a bundle of them, and believe you me, you don't want to be there. So anyway, Captain Crumpler. He started working for the Kinzies in, I believe it was 1924, and in 1925/26, a ferry began running from Punta Rassa over to the Reed's home place. It was basically an adjunct to selling some land. That particular ferry didn't last very long. The 1926 hurricane took care of that. But afterwards, another ferryman from Pensacola brought a ferry down and tried to start running back and forth. Didn't really like what he was doing. Of course, everything was kind of diminished after the storm and as the Depression and the Great Bust was beginning to happen. So he offered his ferry for sale, and Captain Crumpler talked the Kinzies